for our practice, determined that there is at least $1 billion total market that you can identify. Because as a startup, it doesn't matter what the economy does. From zero, you can always grow. And there are three basic things in semiconductors which related to growth to the question. It's fairly constant, and that's what's nice with semiconductors. It's difficult from a technical point of view, but if you master the three basic things, performance, power, and cost, you will always be able to compete. But it is so strong in technology that if your strategy is to enter a large market, you better be the best in design. You just have to put away people who are already incumbents in that market. But if you can attend to all of those three, I have some over the years came with what I call beliefs. If you take those three things and you lump them all together and you have 2x over the best that you are competing with, you will be noticed by customers. At 5x, for sure you will get revenues. At between 5 to 10, you will be a leader. But that's so hard to do. So, growth, of course, has to do with competitiveness. Make sure the market is there. But if you attend to the basic things in any market, I guess, you'll grow.
Are there any strategies that you have you'd like to suggest that your companies in the past focus on? And so that's what interests you. Those are companies that you're interested in investing in and working with.
Yeah.
But in advocating to management things they should be focusing on to grow their company, are there any things particular you've seen successful in the past?
Yeah, once you have currency, and whether you're private or public, you do have to begin to think about organic versus inorganic. And for example, at Marvell, I guess we acquired a few little companies before IPO, but after IPO, we made a gamble in buying a large company, not as large as we were at that time, for $2 billion. We did that simply because we wanted to grow in the platform. But use your currency, whatever that may be. At Surf, we were private. We had a hard time going into the automotive market, but we observed that Conexant was already there. And we were beating them in those three things that I mentioned. So we approached them and said, look, it's just a matter of time that we're going to kill you in the market. We might as well acquire your division. So we gave them 20% of the ownership at Surf. At IPO, it was worth $200 million. So, you have to, growth is such a hard thing to do, obviously, but there's so many things. If the market you chose, it's actually hard to penetrate, then you have to look at how you could get in there, whether you sell part of your company with or merge with somebody. Those are all available techniques. IPO, however, gives you a lot of currency because I contend public money is the cheapest. VC money is expensive. So that currency you have to use in many cases. If you look at the big guys now, Cisco, Broadcom, even Marvell and others, they use it properly.
Bill, at Cassatt or at BEA, any reflections on growth strategies, and particularly that seem to work for your successes?
I think you have to tell your growth strategy to the market you're in and what the stage of the market is. If you're in a really, really early market that will go through a stage of disruptive innovation, which, by the way, we're moving beyond that in most IT markets. I mean, obviously, in the semiconductor market, the disruptive innovations that can form the billion-dollar companies that can make IPOs are much rarer than they were in the 70s. Well, software is going through the same thing. As soon as you see a market where the large players are consolidating, you're beyond the disruptive innovation. In disruptive innovation, you need to be at the front edge. I believe that disruptive innovation in this next era is mostly going to be about monetizing and creating new pull markets out of Web 2, 3.0, whatever you want to call it. The web, which is not a technology in itself. The web is the conversation or interactions that people and groups of people can have on the web. Within IT, so if you're in the disruptive innovation, it's really I believe that there's three stages. One, first you have to find out what's your vision for what the disruption is, and what's your strategy for attacking that disruption in a way that you undermine the economics of the previous incumbents. And a disruption is something, to Dado's point, going back to the Peter Drucker rule, it has to have at least a 10x better return on the customers for what you're selling than the way they're currently doing it. Otherwise, the economics won't be compelling enough to justify the switching costs. Well, if you have that, it's easy to state and hard to do. The first thing is you need to build your product and service and validate that it actually brings value to customers. And when I say validate, means you have to get out and sell it and figure out how the customer is going to buy it, et cetera. I remember talking to Dan Warmenhoven back in about 95 or 96 when we were starting to get BEA going. How did they make the breakthrough? He said, well, we sold to everybody. We almost went out of business doing it until we discovered there was a real value proposition in the people who were designing chips, because by using our stuff, they could cut the time in half. And it's all about how fast you got to market. So that's a disruptive innovation. But first you have to figure out what that value is. The second, you have to calibrate your channel model. Hiring a lot of people or getting a lot of partners going doesn't do anything until you calibrate how the cost of your sale, whether it's how you can make it reproducible, et cetera. And then if you're in a disruptive market, which we were lucky enough to be in BEA, at that point you should be able to scale your sales as fast as you can scale your channel. And that's all about really setting up. And by the way, that is not an art, that's a science. And if your salespeople aren't giving you all the metrics on how to measure productivity and return, et cetera, and you can't calibrate that, it won't work. Backing up to the next level, where we're mostly in the IT markets today, in what I call continuous innovation, where there are new things being developed, but the opportunity to go disrupt a market and build yourself into a billion-dollar company becomes very, very hard, and especially in the era now. I was just on a panel at Stanford a few weeks ago, about a month ago, and part of the results of the Kaufman study stated that, Kaufman Foundation, we've gone from the vast majority of positive monetizations of IT companies, over the last 20 years before this decade was IPO. In this decade, it's 7% are IPOs, 93% are M&A. I'm talking about positive monetization. Now, what that means is what you're really doing is a continuous innovation, and the big guys are there. You're not disrupting their economics. So the chances of getting all the way to an IPO or even staying independent after an IPO is not that large. It can happen, but you're going to have to do some of the strategies that Dado said, take a lot of chances to roll up things and create a much bigger platform to go compete. If you're in a continuous innovation market, what you need to do is you're not going to have what's called a flanking strategy, outflank the incumbents and undermine their economics. Very seldom will you have that. So you have to find a strategy that will allow you to penetrate the market and scale your economics in a way that as much as possible adds value to the incumbents, and that you can leverage their economics as much as possible. And then you get to grow your sales and determine if there are strategies that will allow you to get big enough to remain independent longer. But I think you need to understand where in the market you're in, what level of innovation is currently happening and where you are in that cycle. Because the higher you are in that cycle, the more that you can enter something that's hard for the incumbents to just roll over. And I'll just make one more point. Clean tech's a great market, but it's not disruptive innovation. Not disruptive innovation because the cost, it's not 10 times better return for those that are doing it. It actually costs more. How many in this room are going to run out today and throw the car you have away so you can buy a nice clean tech car? You know, and the same things with solar cells, everything else. That's going to be a really long adoption market, and that means the big guys get a lot of opportunity to either copy you or buy you, et cetera. So you really have to understand that dynamics of where you are in the innovation scale and what the competitive environment is going to be about when you're figuring out your model.
A couple stats along the lines of what you just said that I gathered for this. So in 2007, there were approximately 76 IPOs of VC-backed companies in the U.S. In 2008, that dropped to 7. In 2009, actually, we had a pickup up to 9. No. But in 2010, I'm hopeful, you know, knock on wood, that things get better based upon the number of S1s that are being worked on right now. And I know just in our office here at Fenwick, we should be able to match 2009. But we'll see which of those companies go public. And then on the M&A side of things, things did get softer, but you're right there, that's where the money was. So in 2007, 480 exits of VC-backed companies in the U.S. earning about $55 billion. In 2008, the volume dropped by 25% to 374 M&A exits, but the amount, the value dropped by more than half to $25.3 billion. And in 2009, in the first 3 quarters, around 225 deals, netting around $9 billion. So 2009 has been a difficult market for the M&A market as well. And setting the stage, and John, I might guess what your perspective is having read your book. Maybe you can give some thoughts on growth strategies that you've seen successful in the past.
It's going to appear a bit opportunistic and commerce-driven, but I'm a pure entrepreneur. I start these things from zero. And I've been hit over the head once with a shovel, and it's never going to happen. Again, my first deal went well, but I think I was too young to know the difference. My last deal went well, but if we had sold a couple of quarters later, I think it would have gone like the second deal. Bottom line, I spent a year in R&D. I spent a year growing as fast as I can organically, typically through a direct sales model. I'm an enterprise guy. And then I spent a year growing as fast as I can inorganically. Per the points that were made, I'm trying to establish a channel and related relationships so I can take my direct revenue from 100% down to maybe 70%. And then I've modeled synergy, right, in front of a potential acquirer. I've proven what I've needed to do as a startup. So how big do I want to get? I look to probably put 10 million in revenue on the board and then get out. And if I'm doing anything worthwhile, one of my 6 competitors is going to sell to Oracle or Cisco or Microsoft or Google. And then what am I supposed to do? I mean, how am I supposed to win deals when I was disruptive? Hopefully, it's not worth starting a company if you don't do something interesting. But then the other guy was disruptive, and I can no longer beat him because he's under Oracle's flag or under Cisco's flag. And I just don't see another way to do it. These days, especially now, talking about the venture capital data, as of 2007, venture-backed companies had to be about 9 years old to go public. And that's a long time. But an even more interesting statistic is that our founder stock at that time, on average, and I know this sounds low, was about $6.5 million. So $6.5 million across each founder, 9 years. Now, if you do the arithmetic, if I start a deal with 2 of my co-founders, we keep 51% control. How much do we have to sell for to equal that average payout? And it's less than 50 million. And you can do that in a third of the time. And I would argue a tenth of the risk as a function of time, but also because you keep control of the company. You don't suffer the same dilution trying to build something that's much larger. So look, I've been pining away my whole career trying to build something recognizable. Barossa had 25 million users at the time of Oracle's acquisition. You've never heard of the company. It's internet banking security, so a lot of it is white labeled and you're using it and you don't know. Now it's probably used by 200 million people because it's under Oracle's flag. So I'm living vicariously through our inventions. We recently received some patents as well. Our inventions under a world-class flag. And that's how I rationalize to myself that I'm not building something sustainable or long-living. But let me just repeat again, getting hit over the head by that shovel. When I was running a 100-person company, it was December of 1999, and I had all these guys on my board that you dream about, and everyone was telling me we're going to go public. Come to that board meeting in April of 2000, and everyone was saying we have to do, I see the heads in the audience, we have to do a 40% reduction in force. And I said, what the hell's going on? That's what happens in these things. And I would argue that the next economic downturn, that could be a debt bubble or worse, this is a perfect time to start a company, but you have 3, 4, 5 years to get out before the next catastrophe. So it is hugely opportunistic. But what I say to my business school students, I mean, your colleagues pursuing medicine and law down the hallway who work like crazy. At first they make Xeroxes or they serve in their residency, but eventually they're handed the keys to the kingdom, and you guys are expected to have your eureka moment in the lab followed by a lifetime of pain. And I don't see it that way.
So are you suggesting that part of the challenge, part of the focus on focusing on selling the company rather than going public is just because the economic life cycles are so short that you end up hitting the wall like we did this last year, and it takes too long. If the average company goes public after 9 years, you just never get there?
In a macro sense, I'm suggesting, yes, that it's very difficult to build something sustainable having to contend with Q1 of 2000 or Q4 of 2008. It's very difficult to continue building through that. But even more than that, the math no longer reconciles for the entrepreneur. As I mentioned, the value of our stock at IPO, on average, can be achieved much, much earlier, much more efficiently, and the odds are much greater if we do it a different way. Now, the business we covered a few quarters ago was what's wrong with Silicon Valley, and you have these fantastic guys like Grove saying, no one wants to build another Intel. Intel has, what, a $3 billion R&D budget? Oracle, something like that. I mean, how are we going to compete with that over the long term? And when I talk like this, the first day of class, the reactions are bewilderment. I mean, we've all been trained to be insanely great. This is Silicon Valley. But it just doesn't work that way anymore.
So Josh, Jon's advocating this position from an entrepreneur's perspective. How about from the venture capitalist perspective? What do you think is the best path?
Well, probably not surprising that I disagree with some points. I think, we've lived through probably the worst 10 years of economic history, arguably since the 1920s. I think the problem with looking backwards, I think Jon's absolutely right. His strategy was unquestionably the right way to go for an entrepreneur looking to maximize the probability of success and minimize risk over the last 10 years. I think the question is, if you look forward the next 10 years, are the conditions going to be the same? A couple observations, I'd say. Large companies are not very good at innovation, and so while there are some industries where scale matters a lot, so semiconductors would be one where you have a heavy capital requirement, CapEx requirement. Enterprise software would be another where having a large sales force can be an advantage in certain categories. I think that large companies in general, the reason startups exist is because large companies are not very good at innovating. If you think about what would have happened if Google was acquired by Yahoo for $1 billion, as they were had an offer to do, maybe I think that was about 2002, 2003, or what if Zynga gets bought by EA, or one of our companies, Tesla. How successful would Tesla be as a division of General Motors? I don't think they're going to be quite as innovative. I think that it would be a shame for our society and for the economy if M&A becomes the only exit path, simply because I think it preserves a static order of things as opposed to creating new disruption. I think something that's maybe not fully appreciated within the technology community is how important the capital markets can be as you get to the later stages of a company's growth. And capital markets are inherently cyclical. The IPO market has been broken for 6 or 7 years now. And I think that that's a structural problem with many causes. I personally think that it's a fixable problem. I think it'll take time. I know that there are a lot of really smart people out there, Paul Denninger at Jefferies jumps to mind, who are working to address that. And I think that we as a country need to look very closely at some of the regulations that we've passed over the last years in reaction to things like Enron. So Sarbox gets a lot of blame. I don't think it's entirely to blame, but I think it's a big part of it. I think the separation of banking and research is something that was not very well thought through in terms of the impact that would have for young companies to access the capital markets. But I think that if we're able to fix that, it's going to ultimately produce significantly greater returns, both for investors and for entrepreneurs and for the country as a whole. So I guess it may be that the next 10 years are going to be the same as the last 10, and the best we can hope for is $50 million exits. But I personally find that a little depressing, and hope that we can aspire to somewhat greater heights than that.
It's not depressing when you own 20% of the company. I mean, I wish that for you guys.
Well, so Dado, along those lines, so what do you do when you see a different alignment of management's perspective, the founders, and the VC's perspective, and how have you seen that affect the growth strategies for the company?
Let's see. At the end of the day, the board decides. Whether we like it or not, the biggest decisions for any company has to be decided by the board. So whether you are an entrepreneur or a VC on the board or an independent board member, that's it. So you don't really care who you are. And hopefully the discussions at the board is about how do we maximize the return for everyone. Our practice, and whether it's not just Tallwood Venture Capital that does it, we do care about keeping the innovators in the company, and we try to maintain a well-run, I think, startup at IPO. When I say well-run, employees continue to innovate, good managers, and properly motivated through ownership should be around 20 to 25% ownership at IPO. Now, unfortunately, the longer the company struggles and continue to spend money, that ownership diminishes, obviously. So there is usually a range where the entrepreneurs have to be part of that suffering, where they cannot just keep on maintaining that level of ownership. A struggling company that eventually makes it, typically, let's say 9 to 10 years at IPO, probably lower than 20% ownership by the management and founders. So I don't know. It does not matter who you are. Hopefully, both sides are motivated enough to know what it takes to build a company and then make the right decisions. At least the way we work with our companies is that we tell our entrepreneurs, look, we are all in this thing right now. We will try to keep you whole. We can totally dilute you, which we don't, because if we lose you, where is the company anyway? Mm-hmm. But, sometimes there's always that conflict. You cannot eliminate it. Some entrepreneurs think that they should own the world, and we tell them, you're full of shit, You haven't built anything yet, so we are here to work together. Be reasonable. And sometimes we just have to fire people. I mean, the board has to do that. Whatever it takes to make sure the company is successful.
Okay. So, Bill, I feel like we're being whipsawed here in the Valley a little bit. 2007 was strong. End of 2008 and 2009, we hit a wall. I mean, just a solid brick wall. And now all of a sudden, here I am saying, oh, gee, a lot of companies want to go public, and and we're filing a bunch of S1s, and this is all just in a couple, 2 or 3 years. So what's an entrepreneur to do? How are you supposed to figure out where your growth strategy is if the capital markets are so much in flux right now?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think that the sort of bottom line is as long as the number one thing to do as an entrepreneur is focus on the value proposition for your customer. No matter what you're doing, if you don't have a value proposition for a customer, and that will motivate them not only buying you but sticking with you. I call it the 3 Ps: a vision for exploiting a dislocation or technology innovation that is compelling, that is realistic, and that you can capitalize on, that brings value to customers, and building a company based on values. I think that's what I call the 3 Bs. If you can focus on that, it's through the ups and the downturns. The best time to start a company is in the downturns. I mean, you might not get the best deal from venture capitalists, but you have time. But if you really are building on a vision that 3 to 5 to 10 years out, is going to be able to build a market or market opportunity. That's what you have to focus on. I'll give you one entrepreneur point, though. If you have an opportunity to get money from a venture capital or whoever you have opportunity to get the money from, the number one thing that you can do is to try to find the best partner. I mean, everybody talks about, I talked to 100 companies and I finally got some money. Well, it's not. The thing isn't about just about getting money. It's about getting a good partner that can add value to you and that has a proven track record. Because it's not that there's a lot of VCs that come and go really quickly, but they don't. You look for the ones that know how to stick with you as long as you're creating value. We had some downtime in the very early part of BEA. I mean, I was trying to buy Tuxedo, and which I did that BEA as a roll-up to begin with, to create on the philosophy that the enterprise software company is only 2 first order things: a channel, which dictates the amount of revenue you have, and a product space and where you are in the level of innovation. I decided that that it would take me 5 years to build the product and make it mission critical. But by 5 years, at the end of the decade, I felt that the network explosion would be going through its consolidation if you weren't $500 million to $1 billion. So I needed to buy a product that allowed me to build a channel to sell for the same reason that our vision of what eventually was called a web app server would be. And that's why I bought Tuxedo. But what ended up happening was I negotiated a deal to buy it for $92 million on future payments. So there was no money down. We were using all of our venture to build the company. And the day before, we were buying from Novell. The day before Novell was supposed to sign the deal, we get a call from Joe Marangi and said, Bill, Warburg has to guarantee the loan. I went, I don't even know if the bylaws would allow him to guarantee a $92 million loan. So I called Bill Janeway, and he says, fly back here. So I flew back to New York, and I went into this meeting the next morning with him and their chief investment officer, and went through the whole thing, and they said, okay, we'll guarantee the loan. So I'm walking out of the room. We had negotiated our funding at $50 million. And $50 million was that we would take down as we built the company. We were incented to take down the whole $50 million because they took less and less and less equity. They wanted us to take the whole. But if we took down the whole $50 million, they own 75% and we own 25%, which, by the way, is exactly where we ended up at IPO. So it's pretty. But the interesting thing is, I walked out of that office with Bill Jane when we went back to his office. I said, Bill, we got to talk about the structuring of the deal because she just guaranteed a $92 million loan. He looked at me and said, we own enough of your company. Let's talk about it in a year. By the way, they made $8 billion out of their $50 million, so they did okay.
Not bad.
Awesome.
So, Jon, you've written a book reflecting on growth strategies for companies, and I know it goes beyond just focusing on selling yourself versus building yourself to go public and remain independent. Can you share with the audience and us some of your perspectives on some of the future, what current newly started companies should be focusing on for the growth strategies and some of the trends?
So I believe the most important strategic concern is actually designing towards that point of acquisition. But how do you do that from inception? Echoing what was just said, focus on the quintessential customers, again, speaking from an enterprise perspective, that might resonate with that potential acquirer in the future. So I'll take half the revenue from an enterprise customer than I would from the guy down the street if I think that that customer is, the half revenue customer is more technologically discerning, or technologically discerning enough to help me build a cutting edge product. So last time, Internet Security for Banks, we focused only on the top 20 banks in the world. Why waste your time trying to go after others? And when we won Wells Fargo, that's when we knew that we had designed something that could immediately be plugged into any acquiring organization in the world, and that many acquiring organizations in the world would want to get closer to Wells Fargo. Oracle, Wells Fargo is their 10th, 12th most important customer on the whole roster. So I could have horsed around trying to get Wachovia or Washington Mutual, that were a lot more impressive, of course, in 2005 than they are today. Our second largest customer was National City Bank. Worked like crazy, pulled out our teeth to win that customer, and they basically disappeared. So again, the economic timing thing. But if my most important strategic goal is a hypothesis that I have about a cross-section of acquirers, let's say 3 or 4 or 5 years into the future, then how can I reverse engineer my path to that point? The right customers, the right financial engineering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we exceed our expectations, if we're blowing out the revenue number, if we're growing in other ways much more quickly than anticipated, then we can always say no. We don't have to hire an investment bank. And when we get that knock on the door, we can say no to a deal. But we've architected the company the right way, I believe, to continue growing. In my mind, and again, I have to make a living at this, I believe that entrepreneurship is about having control. And so I say when it's time to sell. I have 3 people on my board. One guy who's worked with me for 18 years. He's been the CTO every time. And then it can be anyone. It could be an outside academic. It could be my attorney. I don't go to 7-person boards. You know, I don't leave this stuff to chance. I'm the one taking time away from my family every day. And when the time comes, I don't want it to be a board's decision. The last deal returned 6x to preferred. My first deal returned 4x to preferred. The one in the middle raised $18 million. We returned $3 million was an asset sale. I never, ever go through that. And I did exactly what I was supposed to do. I grew revenue every quarter over quarter, and we signed the partners, and we did this. And all of a sudden, no more money was available to get profitable quickly enough. So why not architect around that situation so we never have to be fired or face it, so to speak? And then again, if we can build something much more significant than we were anticipating, fantastic. But we have a foundation that we can work from rather than going in the wrong direction.
Jon, when you say that you set a goal and then work backwards from that, I know from my experience with clients that get sold, one of the best ways to maximize value is if you have many companies that want to buy them, a sense of competition. Are you generally considering companies or building companies where you have many acquiring potential acquirers? Or are you focused on build so Cisco buys you type of thing?
Pretty much. The most acquisitive, the latter. The most acquisitive guys in the country, in the world, are the names that we all know. Half dozen guys. That's who I'm building towards. They're seeing every deal anyways, That's the new IPO. Oracle's president said it 2 years ago. That's our IPO event now, is selling to one of those guys. And that's what this book is about, is basically all the different ways you design to do that. And what technology platform you build on is critical. And I'm talking to a lot of very smart guys who are trying to skimp on that $50,000 or $100,000 database license fee because they're a startup and they're trying to survive. And in the end, Microsoft is going to walk away from that deal because they haven't built it to be infinitely scalable. It's like you shoot yourself in the head on day 7.
Josh, in your area of focus of software companies and internet companies, how have you seen cloud-based services affect growth strategies for those companies? And the proliferation of cloud-based.
Yeah, so I think, cloud is goes right to the heart of what I was talking about earlier in terms of, what are the advantages of large companies? Well, it used to be in enterprise software, you're going after big deals. The sales cycles would be 6, 9, 12 months. Scale mattered a tremendous amount because the way that you would get a customer to write you a check is you had to go out and you had to proactively sell them on the software. What I think cloud and the internet and delivery of applications through the browser has allowed companies to do, Salesforce probably being one of the most successful early examples, is to radically change how the software is sold and delivered. And so as opposed to needing to go install a pilot, which might take months and tens of thousands of dollars, you just give the customer a login. You say, look, you want to check out my software? Come try it. I mean, this is something that's been true in the consumer internet forever with applications like Hotmail and Google Apps. Most of the companies that we have today, sales has become more of an order-taking process from existing customers where you're either signing someone up on a limited time trial or even as a free user where there's some premium upgrade. One of my companies, Box.net, is very similar to this. They sign up on average 3,000 or 4,000 new users a day, some percentage of which convert through to the paid product in a very predictable funnel. Sugar CRM would be another one of my companies. It's an open source product where we don't spend time. I loved John's point about not wasting time on sort of bad customers. I think it's a brilliant strategy he had about just going after the top 20 banks. With Sugar in the open source world, we said early on, we're not going to waste time trying to go to companies and tell them about Sugar CRM. We're going to focus on press. We're going to focus on awareness. We're going to focus on making the software infinitely available on every site we can find. And then when someone calls us and says, we get calls from big companies saying, hey, can you come out and tell us about Sugar CRM? We'd say, no, but you can download it for free. You can try it out. Once you've decided that this is the product for you, if you need us to help answer a few questions, then we'll help you out, and we actually charge them for the professional services work to do that. So effectively, customers are paying for their own sales process. That's not going to work for a large chunk of the customers that have made enterprise software successful over the years. But I would argue that the markets are in some ways a pyramid. The technology industry is traditionally focused largely at the top of that pyramid where the very big, heavy organizations are. I think Salesforce took it down one level. Google has taken it almost to the infinite extreme at the bottom. And I think that while the IT markets are fairly well matured and developed at the top end, at the, let's say, global 2000 level or even a tier below that, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity of bringing what used to be enterprise-only technology down to the mass market. One comment I just want to make, I'm listening to the stories and the anecdotes. It's fascinating to hear the experiences. I think that one thing that maybe has contributed, coming through the last 10 years, it's hard not to be a little cynical. And I think that the Valley has lost a bit of the spring in its step. And part of that I would attribute to what I might call transactional thinking, where, it's getting the deal done, and it's, the VCs are kind of, trying to put the wrench to the entrepreneurs because they're unhappy, and the entrepreneurs are pushing back against the VCs because they're unhappy. Really, sort of everybody's pissed off and unhappy, and that's kind of contributing to the problem. I think if you go back 20 or 30 years and you talk to the guys, what Bill said about the VCs who have been around for 20 years, I think is absolutely right. When you talk to those guys, they have a very different attitude than sort of the younger folks. I mean, they're much more kind of chill. It's, hey, let's talk about it in a year. It's this very relaxed attitude towards, I think, long-term value creation as opposed to what are you going to do for me next quarter? How am I going to get out of this deal? Where's my exit? The IPO didn't used to really be thought of as an exit per se. It was actually just a step, a much earlier step in the value creation process. Go back 20 years, your typical IPO technology would have, what, $20, $30 million in revenue maybe? Something like that. And if you looked at the subsequent value creation post-IPO, take a company like an Intuit or a Microsoft, you're talking about 100x, 1,000x potentially from when they went public to where they are today. You flash forward to today, the IPO has gotten so far out of reach where, to do a successful public offering, you have to be raising north of $100 million, which implies a pre-money valuation north of $500 million. It's become so far out of reach that I think people, they're so tired by the time they get there that they look at it as an exit. I think that we need to figure out as an economy and a capital markets how to fix that. And I think that there are some very clever solutions being brought to bear. Just yesterday, there's a Russian outfit, DST, that has bought a huge chunk of Zynga. And they bought some primary, as I understand it, but a lot of it was secondary. They did the same thing at Facebook. That type of transaction, that type of buyer is actually, I think, filling some of the role that the IPO void has left, which is it isn't reasonable to expect entrepreneurs to have to persevere for 10 plus years, toiling it out while the VCs say go bigger and bigger. But if you have someone who's willing to step in and provide liquidity for founders earlier on, I think it can align those incentives. We were investors in Skype. This maybe is not well known. Li Ka-shing, the Hong Kong billionaire, did something very similar at Skype, which enabled the Skype founders to hold on longer and go for the bigger outcome. So, I guess I would just sort of sum it up as I think that if we can get more towards a long-term orientation towards value creation versus this very short-term transactional thinking, I think it'll actually benefit all parties.
Karen, why don't I now turn it over to the audience for their questions?
Yeah.
She's got the microphone.
Do you refer to anybody interest that discern between a short-term hit and a long-term substantive effort?
Do we refer to psychiatrists? Yeah. I feel like a psychiatrist sometimes, counseling my partners and entrepreneurs. Yeah.
For good reason.
Yeah.
Jon, maybe you can comment. I think you fairly clearly articulated the idea that you have to design yourself for an exit. You find yourself then building the company that it fits into one specifically, usually, maybe a few acquirers. How do you find the trade-off? Because typically you find people get nervous that you're suiciding yourself to that acquirer and therefore losing your position at the negotiating table. Do you have any comment on how you see that trade-off?
The negotiating table is an important point, so hold that thought for a moment. But as far as the whole strategic objective of the company, I find I build a much stronger company when I'm thinking this way. I get to profitability more quickly. I don't waste time, as I mentioned. All the things that will make my good engine fit into a great engine makes for a better engine to begin with. The negotiating table is very different, though, because you read me a mile away and these guys read me a mile away. I leave some money on the table, pure and simple. If I'm sitting across the table from Oracle, these guys are the best in the world. There's no doubt about it. If I'm sitting across the table from, I don't have a top 20 fund like Josh sitting between me. I don't have these guys protecting me, and you lose some money that way, but you have control. And most deals of this size happen because of relationships anyways. They want the team. And then there's the technology and everything else. So, in every $50 million deal, you're going to leave 5 or 10 or more on the table. But I'll mention again, in my last company, the transaction was announced in July of 2007. It was internet security for banks. What would have happened if that deal was announced in January 2008? Or or later. And I think Oracle got a great company. We worked very hard. But if you're in internet security for banks and banks fall off a cliff, and I've seen that happen in other verticals that I've been in before, you can't wait. So money is left at the negotiating table. People read what you're about a mile away, but you can always say no. You have competing offers, and within reason, you do the best you can. They know that you're coming at them for that purpose, but at the same time, I think more and more of my colleagues are doing the same. Oracle sees everything out there. So do the most acquisitive guys, and if they're seeing every deal, it's not just me who is being this opportunistic, and that's probably the biggest reason, by the way, that I advocate this strategy so passionately. Is no matter what I'm trying to do, there's going to be the guy that wants to sell to them as well, and I just don't know how to compete against that. If I've built something disruptive that a big company can't do because they're a bit slower, in this case it was RSA Security last time. So I've got something that RSA can't do for a moment in time, but then they buy a company called Passmark, a company called Cyota, which was doing what I was doing, and they integrate that. And then all of a sudden I'm trying to sell internet security to banks against RSA, who has my technology, against VeriSign, who has my technology. I can't win with that, so I do it what I do.
You have the mic.
Yes, thank you very much for your insight this morning. It's been very interesting. I lived through the whole internet boom and bust, and I would very much appreciate the panel's experience and comments on the role of the VCs in transactional nature of these various businesses. In particular, I remember it used to be like the board meeting was sitting around and say, well, where's your launch party going to be? Who's going to be your celebrity spokesperson, and so on, so on. So as an entrepreneur during that time, you're doing what you're told. And in the end, you're the one who left holding the bag. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Dado, have you seen a change between, you and I were talking about one of my clients that went public with great fanfare and then sold itself for pennies.
The bubble is, you might as well forget that. That is not the right way to gauge what we do here, whether you're an entrepreneur or a VC. That's an aberration. But if you look at pre-bubble and now, it's back to really normal. The practices are always there to do the right thing, I believe. All these exits that we talk about, surely they are liquidity events, and simply that's the way we should look at it. Nobody exits assuming that the business is good. You have to continue. In fact, it gets harder and harder, but that event of using your currency to continue to do the right things will always be there. So I think your question related to when the market was frothy and you don't have a product you get bought for 10 billion or whatever. We did all of those things, and I have to be upfront with you. The VCs made a lot of money even with lockup. They were smart enough to distribute right away. By practice, we have to distribute to whoever we work with. And so it's a secondary liquidity event. You're forced to sell, kind of. You can keep it, but there's that event. Entrepreneurs got caught in the downturn. However, I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs, I've talked to them, kind of like being a psychiatrist, because they were holding $1 billion of net worth. They went and bought a house for $50 million, not wanting to sell because thinking it will still go up. At the end of the day, they were minus $50 million. So there are a lot of horror stories. And you can go both ways. Who made the mistake there? I think it's all about market conditions. If we are not aware that we are in a frothy market, like the last bubble, we all got fooled. I mean, even the brightest VCs, entrepreneurs, we all made a mistake. No one can be blamed. We were all, what we thought, doing the right things. Right now, it's normal. Entrepreneurs have a lot of time to push back. VCs have a lot of time to do the right due diligence. There's practically no pressure. To your point, when the market is low, what it gives us on both sides is our entrepreneurs who, if their idea is good, they can pick the VCs that they want to work with value add. The VCs on the other side will really spend the time to scrutinize whether your ideas are good. It's good for the whole practice, I believe. You can actually build a much better company. This thing about launch party and that sort of stuff, I think that's an aberration. So I would not even think that we should think about those things because it's the wrong model.
Well, I wouldn't let VCs off quite so easily. I think we were very culpable as part of that process. There was, I think, as Dado says, there was a method to the madness on all sides, which was, look, you could fund a company as an entrepreneur or a VC. You're going public 18 months later at 50 times revenues, maybe infinity times revenues. It was just a very odd time, and it was a in retrospect, it was like what's the game? Musical chairs. Who's going to be the last one left standing? We saw the exact same thing more recently in the financial crisis. I think markets tend towards that kind of exuberance. It goes to what I was saying before about the sort of short-term transactional thinking. People weren't thinking about building companies. They were thinking about, how do I get to the exit? How do I take this thing public and hand it off to the next sucker? So I think I think Dado's right. We shouldn't focus on it. We shouldn't allow it to stop us from doing the right things now. I think we should only remember it to the extent that we remember not to do that again.
I think the point I'm trying to drive to, and I may not have stated that clearly, was how should the entrepreneur go about protecting himself or herself in that? You have a board situation, 3, 4, 5 members of the board, agree on a strategy.
Yeah.
The entrepreneur executes that strategy, and then things don't work out well.
Well, I think it's important. So I wouldn't go quite to the extreme of, Jon expressed a point of, I have total control, and I never mean to give that up. And I think, he's seen the other side of that, and I think you're seeing that reaction. I'm not sure I'd quite go, I think it should be more of a partnership, but you said the opposite. You said, my board told me to go have a launch party and hire celebrities. I don't think either one's right. I think as an entrepreneur, you're running the company, it's your company. Your venture investors should be partners for you, they should be advisors for you. But at the end of the day, it's your company, and you need to make those decisions. And so I think that, I would fall somewhere in between those. I don't think that the entrepreneur, it's simply about just protecting yourself. If you feel like you need to protect yourself from your investors, you probably have the wrong investors.
Bill, what's your perspective on that?
I had a breakfast yesterday morning with an entrepreneur, a private company that has had its best quarter ever, about a $40 million run rate. And this was one of those breakfasts that you sit down and it's the old guy talking to the young guy, and I said, you're doing a phenomenal job right now. I mean, unbelievable job. There's only one thing you're not doing. You're not managing your board. This is to Jon's point. If you end up taking VC money, maybe you can't control your board to 3 people. It doesn't matter how many people are on your board, that situation will, whatever you can manage it to. But you manage your board by, in my personal opinion, by working with them to set the perceptions and expectations. And you do that by involving them in the decision process, but you have to own and drive the strategy, or else you shouldn't be the CEO of the company. And then you should be working with your board to help bring in a CEO that can help work with the board to drive a strategy that's compelling, real. And the way I do it is I turn it into an annual process that revisits, that goes top down, revisits the vision, looks at how that implies the strategy a few years out, and turns it into an operating plan. And the board's involved all the way through that. You're setting objectives and priorities, and you're measuring those. You're getting on that as much transparency as you can with your board. But when you go to a board meeting and you hear nothing but random questions from your VCs and people on it that that says you're not giving them the right information. You're not controlling their expectations. You're not showing progress on what you're doing. They don't understand your sales model or whatever. You said a word that got me going here is they give you the strategy. Well, then you shouldn't be the CEO.
Bob Richards with another question from the entrepreneur's perspective. I appreciate the insights of the entire panel, but Jon, in your model of early exit through high level of influence of the founders and control, how do you manage the valuation of the company in the eyes of the potential acquirer when the company is so dependent on that influence? And how do you personally manage your exit in the eyes of the potential acquirer?
It's my money. The acquirer knows it's my money. They know they can put fingers around my neck easier than they could a general partner in a major fund who's doing 10 deals with them in the next couple of years. But then I tell them, you know, what the value is we expect. And I'm not saying that we get that, but we set expectations. And if they are not going to come close to meeting expectations, we're going to go down the street or we're going to continue operating. And I did what my board told me to do as well. Not so much the event planning, but I remember that time as well. Just because you're a good soldier and you got some talented people working with you and you have your work cut out for you, but you can't control human behavior. You can't control emotion. You can't control these boom busts and the aberrations and everything else. So why not control the equity? And I don't own 51%, but we're three co-founders. Together we own 51%. That's very easy to do. That's not an exercise where you can only build a sandwich shop. You can build a large company by selling 49% of the equity over time, especially if you're doing debt financings versus equity financings. That's a whole other story. How do I manage it, though, personally? One of the toughest questions I have to answer to entrepreneurs first starting out is, how do we hire the great talent? I mean, I'm not so great. How do I hire guys that are better than I am? That's hard. I articulate this argument very clearly. If I'm going to steal you from Microsoft and you're making $200,000 a year right now and you know it's going to be with bonus and this in 5 years, I clearly articulate what our strategy is on the entrepreneur side. And I'm saying you're going to make $3 million from this in 5 years based on your equity holdings and our strategy here. And the only real risk that you have is that we may sell sooner than that, and therefore you'll make 1.8, in 18 months or whatever the ratios are. And if you articulate that and you're working with a team that's seen that over and over again, it's very, very smooth. They either get it financially or they don't want to take the risk. And that's the worst experience that I've ever had with people is taking them out of very lucrative jobs where they have families and everything else and not being able to deliver that second time, right? So that's how I manage personally. One comment that was made, last point, you're seeing a lot of these deals where money's taken off the table, and that's a way for entrepreneurs to exist. And I think it's a great mechanism, especially working with a top-tier fund. But I'll tell you, I don't take a dollar before my investors get their money back. They've been with me a long time, and that's just not the way that I do it. I have the ability to sell 5% of my stock along the way. That doesn't really count. I'm talking about a large amount of money, and then what? I'm the founder, and I leave, and all of a sudden, I made millions of dollars, but then the company goes south. So I can't live with that any more than I can live with an asset sale. So we're in a tough spot. I do think that's a great mechanism, but it doesn't always work.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your experiences this morning. This has been very, very interesting, and thank you all for attending. I'll turn it over to Karen for conclusion.
Thank you very much, Dado, Bill, Josh, John, and of course Mark. And we really appreciate you sharing your stories and perspectives. We appreciate your candor. As a small token of our appreciation, please accept this high-quality but low-cost Churchill Club T-shirt. Thanks again to our host and sponsor, Fenwick. Happy holidays, everyone. See you in the new year.
That's right.
Nice to meet you. Hey, nice to see you. Yeah, good to see you, man. Little battle, but I think it's healthy for the valley.
That was great. This was very interesting. I love this panel.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Great. Nice to see you. I just been saying that.
Thanks for sharing. Your war stories are the best.
Yeah.
I love war stories.
Yeah.
That's what everyone likes to hear.
Anecdotes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Yeah. Okay. Virtualization.
Yeah, I just
Okay.
do in that, the more information. I mean, if you have a great idea and the market is ready, it's difficult to make an argument. But, what can an MBA really teach you? What you need is an investment before the holidays or after.
I remember that.
If you can learn, the only difference between a CEO, startup CEO, I think, or the CTO, at least in my experience, is I'm the finance guy. The CTO is usually smarter than I am. He's building these products, and but I know how to. Full
disclosure, I'm an advisor to
I'm not saying I got that from business school, but why not get that added experience? And by the way, if you are a CTO, and then you can have the finance background, you've got it made. And the best CEOs in the world are the.
But how do you relate to them?
I can shoot you. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's good to see you. Sure. Yeah, they have it outside, which is very nice of you to ask, and then Amazon and the rest of it. You're quite welcome. Pages worth reading. Thank you. Hey,
and they allow the whole environment to
hi.
in real time.
Thank you.
Three-tier architecture.
Thank you.
Database, application, yeah. Matter of fact, they can have it can move itself across data computers and data centers.
Yeah.
Carries that. Yeah. Got to take a look at the number 3 TERA. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's not announced yet, but it's just closing now. CA's 800 million for it. Yeah. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
There's limitations on what they do, so making it more general would be. Yeah.
Putting packages together before.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Of course. I have your information, and what I'll do is I'll respond with mine. I'll send you an email, and just the economics alone of being able to run a company more efficiently. That model makes sense. Now, how you integrate and how you offshoring, because you're not talking about technological.
Well, good luck. It's a big area. Yeah, huge area. Great. Nice to see you.
I think it makes perfect sense. Whatever can keep the costs lower and the efficiency higher while moving. Pleasure to meet you. Of course.
And congratulations on all your
please.
I'm working with a lot of startups right now. Yeah.
Nice to see you.
No, I don't.
I'm trying. I've been to all the business schools and running around, and
oh, wow. Yeah.
You have a new strategy now.
Oh.
You have a problem growing.
Yeah, well, the best guy in medical device around here is Rodney Perkins, but mostly ear. But VCs that do a lot of work there are NEA.
Of course, I have your card. I'll respond with my information. Pleasure. It's good to meet you.
Yeah. Oh, you're too big. Yeah.
Of course. How are you doing? Nice to meet you as well.
Thanks. Hi.
I mean what I say. That's all I say.
So what are you doing?
I'm at Netline now.
Congratulations on your move to the blog. All your colleagues are going to follow, so it's good to be ahead of the curve.
The tornado.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey. Nice to see you as well. And your comment is appropriate, especially if it's on board.
Yeah, it really was. It was a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, and we are the ones that are allowed to have to do it. So.
If there is, my view is it's going to be something having to do with the monetization of the web. But I don't.
That was a huge tornado.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody was saying, okay, semiconductors. I spent 14 years in the semiconductor industry, and we kind of hit a wall, and the cable plants for 14 years.
Well, that was part of this disruption I was talking about. The disruptive innovation has moved through cycles. In the 70s, it was in the 60s, late 60s through early 70s, mid 70s, it was in semiconductors, then went into computers, then it went into enterprise software, then it went to the internet, And I believe we're at a point now where the internet is actually commoditizing all those things, right? So, and the thing to commoditize the internet is the cloud, but the cloud is, it's a really big company thing, right? So you can do compute generation, it's not going to be a tornado itself, but on top of that, the thing that's being built on it is the web.
If you have a problem with something, or if you, well, I have an email address. And sorry that I usually respond, but I write that down for you.
Oh boy!
Excellent.
Oh wow! My name is